and 2. Hello and welcome to the Intellectual Capitalist Show. This is your host, Tony D'Angelo, and joining me on the other side of the screen is one of my new heroes of capitalism, the author of many, many books, but most specifically, The Power of Capitalism, as well as his latest title, In Defense of Capitalism, Dr. Z. Dr. Z, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
Well, I've got to start by first, listeners, you're listening to the podcast, but I get to see Dr. Z, and anybody out there on YouTube, check him out. First things first, we got to talk about not only this man's wealth, but more importantly, his health. Dr. Z, you're an avid fitness enthusiast, right?
Yes, I am. I never did it professional, but I'm in bodybuilding since now 46 years.
And you got the guns to show it. Can you flex him just for posterity's sake here? Look at that.
Okay, so yes, now, but I'm a little bit, I have now an injury since a couple of weeks, so I couldn't train my bicep in the last weeks, but I'm in the training since 46 years, and I'm a fan of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Of course, I don't share all his political opinions, but I like very much his latest film on Netflix about his career, because for me he's a great example of how important this is to set yourself big goals in life. And what I learned when I read all his books, his autobiography and biographies about him, that nothing or the most important thing is to sell things. And this is what sometimes libertarians don't understand. This is also very important for me when I write my books and to get my messages to spread it to the people, because there are a lot of libertarian theorists who are maybe good in abstract theories, but they are not good in sales. And this is what Arnold Schwarzenegger, what you can learn from him, that it's worth nothing what you're doing when you're not able to sell it.
I love it. Sales equals income. Inkeep creates surplus, and surplus creates capital, and capital creates capitalism. So let's move right into that. First, I just love it that you've put the center of your life as your health and your fitness, and then also your finances. I think that's beautiful. And I find that, as Arnold would say, the flabby ones, the lazy ones, are usually not the capitalists, the grinders, the drivers. So I've got to know, what inspired you for our listeners? Again, our listeners are successful entrepreneurs. We focus on helping them package their intellectual property because it is an asset class, particularly here in the US, of course, in Germany as well. And you've done that with over 26 books and titles. Can you help us understand your journey as far as where did you come from and why are you so passionate about protecting, defending, and promoting capitalism?
Yes, to begin, very early in my life, I was very early interested in politics. Even in the age of 8 years, I wrote a letter to the later Chancellor of Germany, Willy Brandt, when I was 8 years old. And then when I was 13 years old, I became a Maoist, and I founded a Maoist group at my school called the Rote Zelle, what means something like red cell. And I was the editor of a newspaper with the name Rotes Banner, what means red flag or red banner. So I was a Maoist, a Marxist at this time. And it remained for maybe 10 years. But then when I started history and politics, I saw the first thing that I realized, that the Marxist theory about fascism is absolutely wrong. And I saw it when I wrote my first doctoral dissertation. It was in 1986. You can also read it in English language. The title is Hitler's National Socialism. And this was a book, a research, a study about Hitler's, especially economic and views, and his views about social policy. And I found out that he was much more anti-capitalist than most people think. So this was how I started as an historian, and then I moved from a city near Frankfurt to Berlin, where I live now since 1987. And first, I was here at the University of Berlin as a historian, but then later I moved to one of the leading conservative newspapers in Germany, and I was there in a leading position. But in 2000, I founded my own company. It was a public relation company focused on the real estate industry, and we became market leader in Germany, #1. I made a lot of money as an entrepreneur, and I invest this money in the German residential real estate, especially here in Berlin. And it was a great time for investment because I bought when almost everyone warned me that it's a bad idea to invest. And I sold a lot of it when everyone said now's the right time for investment. So in a contrarian approach. And then I sold my whole company 7 years ago. And then I came back to what I did before, doing scientific research, writing my books. Now I wrote every year a new book, and I could afford it. It is very expensive. For example, for my new book, we will talk about it later, In Defense of Capitalism, I commissioned a poll in 34 countries about the image of capitalism. And for another book that I published before with Cato Institute, the title is The Rich and Public Opinion, I commissioned another poll, and all these polls cost me $700,000. So it was only possible because I made a lot of money, because no one supported me. Unfortunately, I had to pay it from my own pockets. And what I'm doing now, it's also expensive. My new book is published in 30 countries all over the world. And I promised to visit every single country to promote my book. I was last year in 17 countries, this year in 18 countries, but now the end of November, I will go to my Latin America tour, to Argentina, to Chile, to Paraguay, to Colombia. And then when I came back, I will go even to Nepal. So I visited a lot of countries where I've never been before in my life. And this was also interesting because it was not only for promoting my book. I had a lot of interviews there with TV, with newspapers, lectures. It was also about learning something about these countries, about economic freedom. And this is the material for my next book with a working title, Liberty Road Trip, because I will write about this journey to 30 countries, what I learned about these countries, their economic freedom or in these countries. And you learn a lot when you travel so much.
I could only imagine. Well, that is fantastic, as well as it is fascinating. I would love to add to your moniker of being an academic capitalist. You really are that ability to be that cutting edge. So you have this PhD, you have this history background, but then you have this capitalism to invest in your own research and development, which is just spectacular. And of course, you've really brought that to light to us readers and to your fans in the latest book, In Defense of Capitalism. You talked about something which I love, the word economic, and more importantly, the word freedom. You talked about in Defense of Capitalism, the index of economic freedom and what's happening globally, particularly here. I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm curious, do you mind sharing with listeners some of the extrapolations, some of the things you learned and some of the lessons from the Index of Economic Freedom?
Yes, everyone should know this Index of Economic Freedom that is launched by the Heritage Foundation in the United States. They started in 1995. And this is, you can call it also a capitalism scale, because it's a rating how economically free are the countries all over the world. At the top, you find Singapore and Switzerland. And at the bottom of the list, you find North Korea, Venezuela, and Cuba. And the bad news is that the United States lost since they started the index in this year, 2023. It was the worst ranking since they started the index for the United States. The United States are now in position 25, and there are now even 16 European countries, according to this index, that are more economically free than the United States. And this doesn't mean that it's a good situation in Europe. On the contrary, on the opposite, it's very bad here. But when even 16 European countries, according to this index, are better than the United States. So, and this is the problem all over the world. It's not only in Europe, it's not only in the United States. If you look around the world, you see a different situation as it was after the collapse of socialism. In the beginning of the 90s, almost everyone understood that capitalism is a better system, that socialism failed. At this time, there were politicians in the 80s like Ronald Reagan, for me, the best president of the United States, Maggie Thatcher. And even in China, you had Deng Xiaoping, who started with free market reforms, who introduced private property, what had a great impact for China. When he started with his economic reforms, there were 88% of people in China lived in extreme poverty. Today, it's less than 1%. But if you look what happens now in China with Xi Jinping, they go back to more state, less market. So this is a negative development, what happens in China now. If you look in Latin America, it's almost all socialist. Even in Chile, what was always the most capitalist country in Latin America, and where people are much, much better off than in other Latin American countries. Even in Chile, they voted for a socialist. And of course, Colombia is governed by socialists. In Brazil, they voted for a socialist. Not to talk about Venezuela. Venezuela, this is such a terrible story, because I read now the new figures. Now 7.5 million people fled from Venezuela. This is like 25% of the population. Mm-hmm. And they had an inflation rate a couple of years that was like 1 billion%, and people live in hunger and poverty. And this is so important, because Venezuela, they called it in 2000 the socialism of 21st century, and left-wing intellectuals were so enthusiastic about this, but now it failed. So if you look at Latin America, it's a terrible story. I will go now to Latin America in 3 weeks.
Will your plans take you to Venezuela? Will you go to Venezuela?
No, I will not go to Venezuela, because it's not possible to publish a book like my book, talk about it. But I go back to Argentina, and I'm very curious, because you know there were now the elections in Argentina, and maybe if I go there, I hope Javier Milei will be the president, a libertarian as president of Argentina. And this was, by the way, the biggest libertarian movement that I saw all over the world through my travels. I saw it in Argentina. And so this was Latin America. If we look in Europe, we go more and more in the direction of a planned economy. One example, the EU forbid now the combustion engines for cars from 2035. And, this is one example to make clear what's the difference between a market economy on the one hand and a planned economy on the other hand. In a market economy or in capitalism, entrepreneurs decide what to produce, how much to produce. And in the end, it's consumers' choice. Every day, consumers make their decision. So capitalism is, for me, democracy in the economy, because every day we can make our vote for what products we buy and whatnot. In a planned economy, politicians and government officials decide what is produced and how much is produced, as it is for cars now. I have nothing against electric cars, electric vehicles, and if entrepreneurs like, for example, or companies like Tesla, Elon Musk, if they produce electric vehicles, I'm happy about it, but I think it should be consumers' choice what cars they buy and what not. This is capitalism. This is economic freedom. And so in Europe, we go more and more in the direction of a planned economy with a pretext of the fight against climate change. This is what they tell us: we have to fight against climate change. And in the United States, I don't have to tell you, I mentioned this, that it's the worst ranking in the index of economic freedom. And since years, in Europe, a lot of people think America is pure capitalism. And I have to tell them, this is totally wrong. They have a huge welfare state in the United States. And I just read another book that I can recommend to everyone. It's The Myth About American Inequality.
Myth About American Inequality.
Yes, The Myth About American Inequality. Amazing book with a lot of statistics, and they prove it, how the welfare state became bigger and bigger and bigger in the United States. And one thing that was very interesting in this book, they showed the statistic that for an average American middle-class family, they earn not much than from the lower 20%, because they get so much from the state that in the end, for someone who's working hard from a middle-class family, has not more in his pocket than from someone who lives only on social welfare. So this has nothing to do with capitalism. And so this is, of course, in a way, very depressive if you look what's happening all around the world. But I think we should stand up and fight for capitalism. And this is the reason why I started writing my books, writing my articles, and giving my lectures all over the world to defend capitalism.
That is beautiful. I love it. You said so many powerful things in that little segment, so thank you for that. Let me break a couple down, as well as some other things I've heard you talk about, both in your books and other interviews. You said something powerful to tip upon this myth of inequality in America. It was one of probably the first things that attracted me to your work. I think you were delivering one of your lectures, and you were talking about how powerful capitalism has been at eliminating poverty. And we've shifted the conversation now. Now it's all about inequality. And what's interesting is how the powers that be, let me just say it that way, you can call it the left, the right, but will often take words and completely demolish them and forget how powerful capitalism has at reducing and or eliminating the mass poverty that we once saw in the world. Can you speak a little bit more from that, not just in the US level, but from your global lens?
Yes, absolutely. By the way, this is the first chapter about my book. This is one of the myths about capitalism, that capitalism is to blame for hunger and poverty. You have to know that 200 years ago, before capitalism, 90% of the worldwide population lived in extreme poverty.
Say that again, Doc. Say that again for listeners.
200 years ago, before capitalism, so in 1820, 90%, 90% of the worldwide population lived in extreme poverty. Today, it's less than 9%, from 90 to 9%. This is what happened in 200 years. And what is even more important, half of this reduction happened over the last decades since the end of socialism in Eastern Europe, because even in the 80s, 43% of the worldwide population lived in extreme poverty. And this happened never before in history. I just spoke about the example of China, and I will speak a little bit more in detail, because it's an interesting story what happened there. In the end of the 50s, Mao Zedong realized the biggest socialist experiment in history. He called it the Great Leap Forward in China from 1958 to 1962. 45 million people died in China as a result of this experiment in these 4 years. And the terrible thing is, I spoke about my lectures that I give all over the world. And in every lecture, I ask one question. Have you heard about this biggest socialist experiment in history at school or university? This experiment where 45 million people died. And wherever I speak, whether it's in Asia, in Latin America, in the United States, or in Europe, only very few people, sometimes no one, raise his hand and said, yes, I had heard about this at school. Let me guess that I think 95% of the audience in my lectures, whether I speak to 20 people, to 200 or to 2,000, more than 95% have never heard about this at school. And I think this is terrible. They have heard so much about the alleged evils of capitalism, but they haven't heard about what happened in China at this biggest socialist experiment. So then, after Mao's death, I mentioned this, 88% of the people in China lived in extreme poverty. And then what Deng Xiaoping did, he introduced private property, started with free market reforms. And this was amazing what happened. You don't need, the good thing is with capitalism, you don't need pure capitalism. Even some drops of capitalism help so much that the number of people living in poverty decreased from 88 to less than 1%. Next example, Vietnam. I think everyone in the United States, because of the war in Vietnam, knows something about Vietnam. But what a lot of people don't know is that Vietnam was, even in the 90s, the poorest country in the world, poorer than all African countries. First, there was this war, and there was not only one war. Before Vietnam was in a war with the United States. They were in war with France and with Japan, and later with China, with almost everyone in the world. So they had these terrible wars, and there were 10 times more bombs from the United States on Vietnam than was in World War II on Germany. So there was so much destroyed. And what was not destroyed by the war was destroyed by the planned economy in Vietnam. So Vietnam was really the poorest country in the world. But people in Vietnam, they are smart people. They call themselves socialist and with the Communist Party, but I can guarantee you it's harder to find a Marxist at a university in Vietnam. I was there, than at the university in the United States, or the in Europe. And what they did, they started with free market reforms in Vietnam, 1986, and in the 90s, and the result that the number of people living in poverty decreased from 80% to less than 5% in Vietnam.
Remarkable. All through capitalism.
Yes, because of more capitalism. They don't call it capitalism, they call it socialism, but of course, it has nothing to do with Marxism, with socialism. They invited me at one of the leading universities in Vietnam, the Foreign Trade University, to give a lecture with about the topic, how can we improve the image of rich people? No one invited me in the United States or Europe to have a lecture about how to increase the image.
Well, I'm bringing you to the U.S., Dr. Z. So let me. I want to come back here because I think it's fascinating in your personal story that you were once there too, right? When you were 8 years old and you began to study politics, you were on the other side of the coin. A, how did you get there? But more importantly, B, what was it? What was that satori, that awakening moment where you made that shift from being a Marxist, Maoist, socialist to now writing books? Not only writing books, but more importantly, as Emerson said, who you are, shout so loudly, I do not hear a word you say. In other words, you're a full-blooded capitalist. You've lived the capitalist dream. So how did you go? How did you go from 8 to now where you are today? What's that? Where was that switch?
It was not one moment or one special experience. Serious intellectual development goes over years and years. I trust no one who told me today he thinks this way and 1 year later he has a totally different opinion, because it's a long development. As I mentioned, I was interested very early in politics, but then with 13 years, I became really a hardcore Maoist. And then over the years, it was a little bit more a soft version of Marxism. And so such like a combination between psychoanalysis from Freud and Karl Marx, and this was a little bit more soft. But then it was not a special experience in my life. But what was important is my research in National Socialism that I mentioned before, when I saw that all these theories, the Marxist fascism theory, that the fascism is a form of dictatorship of the financial capital and all this stuff, that this is absolutely wrong. This was very important that I learned it when I studied about Hitler, that this is totally wrong. So.
And what year was that? What year did you write your thesis? When did you write Hitler's National Socialism?
I wrote it when I was 27, 28 years
okay.
old.
So you hadn't turned 40 yet, and but you're still on the other side at this point.
Yes, but it was a long development. It was a long development. You can say this year I was a Marxist, and in the next year I was right. I was not. Even when I wrote my book, I had some sympathies for Marxism, but I did it in a more objective way. So even today, I can publish it. You see it with some formulations that I thought different than I do today, but it's I can still publish it, and it's still worth reading it, because I did it in a very scientific way. It was not about any opinions about Hitler, but I wanted to understand how he thought. And what I understood, that Adolf Hitler became more and more an admirer of the planned economy.
Thinking that he was smarter than everybody else, that the elites could control versus the individuals.
Yes, but he was not a socialist in the way as traditionalists or socialists are. This is the difference between traditional communists and Adolf Hitler. Traditional communists, they wanted to nationalize everything, and to that every company is state-owned. This is what they did in the Soviet Union and in all other countries. Hitler didn't believe in nationalizing everything, but because he was a social Darwinist, and in this way he believed in competition, and he was afraid that if he nationalizes everything, that there will be no more competition. But what he did was, what he said it in a speech. He said, "We, the state, will tell the entrepreneurs what to produce and how to produce. If they do it in this way, we are fine with this. If not, then we will do it." Yeah. So, of course, this has nothing to do with capitalism or with a free market economy, but it's also different from the traditional socialism. And the crazy thing is, if you look around the world today, that we go in the economy also in the direction of a system where the entrepreneurs, they are the owners of their property, but they are not free to make their decision. But the government will tell them what to produce and how to produce. And so this is also what happened in National Socialism in this time, what Adolf Hitler did. So it was, some people say he's a socialist. In a way, of course, he called his own party, the National Socialist Workers' Party, but it was not traditional socialism, but it was a kind of new socialism without nationalization of everything. But I think private property doesn't mean only that you are in a formal way owner of your property, but also that you can decide what you want to do, what you want to produce. This is real capitalism.
Well, and I love it. You said the word economic freedom, where it's all at. Now, again, here on the Intellectual Capitalist Show, we focus on what we call the fifth asset class. It's not what we call it. It's actually codified here in the U.S. in the U.S. Constitution, that individual authors, creators have the exclusive right, which means property. Exclusive right means property, to own, control, and create their ideas and inventions. And it's one of the greatest inventions here in the U.S. And again, you are, Dr. Z, a intellectual capitalist, an academic capitalist, and I would even say an educational capitalist, because we're actually, so I hear what we do in the show. We talk about the problem. It's obvious, but more importantly, we talk about the solutions. We talk and promote we, the warriors who are advancing this word capitalism. So let's give our listeners some support, some guidance, and some solutions. First, Dr. Z, from your lens, how would you define the word capitalism? What does it mean to you? And that's what's cool thing. We can make it up.
So first of all, there is no pure capitalism nowhere in the world, and there is no pure socialism. All systems that exist in reality are mixed systems. I compare it with a test tube with two ingredients, market and state, are capitalism and socialism. As a historian, I don't believe in any utopia of a perfect, pure capitalist system. But as an historian, I look what happens if you add more market. I gave some examples: Vietnam, China.
You talk about Poland's success and transformation, which we've seen, right? Can you speak more to that in this episode?
Okay, before we come to the definition, it's a good keyword, Poland, because I can recommend. I also produced a film. You can get it for free on the internet. The name of the film is Poland: From Socialism to Prosperity.
Poland from Socialism to Prosperity.
You can find it on YouTube.
All right. Just time out, listeners. This man is an intellectual beast. Is everybody getting this? Not only does he have, pythons the size of Arnold's, not only is he cranking out books, not is he only out touring the world, but he's producing movies. Dr. Z, I got to high five you right there. That is,
thank you.
Excuse me. I'm gonna drop a little. My native tongue is not native tongue. I'm English, but I'm gonna drop a little. That's fucking great. Sorry, I just had to say that.
No, thank you for this. And by the way, if we mentioned now this film about Poland, let's tell the story about Poland. Poland was one of the poorest countries in Europe in the 80s.
It was a shithole. It was terrible.
They were even poorer than the Ukraine. Yeah. And the GDP per capita was half of the Czech Republic. So very, very poor. And then they started in 1990 with economic reforms. I know his name is Leszek Balcerowicz. He was Minister for Finance at this time. He is a big admirer of Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. So he's a real pro-capitalist, and I admire him. And he started with economic reforms. And now, since 3 decades, Poland is Europe's growth champion. And standard of living increased dramatically because of more capitalism. So I'll come back to your question, how do I define capitalism? It's very easy. In capitalism, this is what I mentioned before, entrepreneurs decide what to produce, and the basis is real private property. In socialism, politicians decide what to produce. And in reality, this is very important to understand, there is no pure capitalism. I think even you don't need pure capitalism to improve the situation of people dramatically. What I analyze is what happens if you add more state or more market. I gave some examples now, Poland, Vietnam, China, there are a lot of other examples. What happens if you add more market?
I love that.
Example, what happens if you add more state? I mentioned Venezuela, but I will give you more information about Venezuela. You find a whole chapter in my book, The Power of Capitalism, about Venezuela. Venezuela was one of the 20 richest countries in 1970, one of the 20 richest countries in the world. And then they started with things as we do it now in Europe and in the United States, more and more regulation, especially regulation of the labor market. There was no country with such a huge regulation of the labor market as it was in Venezuela. And of course, the situation became bad in Venezuela. But then what happened? People in Venezuela, they didn't understand that the solution would be more capitalism, but they hoped for the solution in even more socialism. And in the end of the 90s, they voted for Hugo Chavez. And Hugo Chavez, all the intellectuals in the world were very enthusiastic about this time. You can see quotes, for example, from Barbara Walters in the United States, and all this left-wing intellectuals, journalists. They spoke about the socialism in the 21st century, and they were very enthusiastic. And in the first years after Hugo Chavez came to power, it was not too bad because he had good luck that the oil prices increased dramatically in these years. Right. And Venezuela depends on oil in a large degree. And so he had a lot of money to spend for social welfare. Even he supported workers in Boston in the United States at this time. So, but then he started with all these crazy things what socialists do. More state, less market, nationalization, and so on. The result, we know it, I mentioned it, but I want to repeat it, that now 25% of the population of Venezuela fled. And they abolished democracy, they abolished freedom of press, freedom of speech, and it's a very terrible story. And now, if you tell this story to socialists, do you know what they will say? Oh no, this wasn't real socialism. And this is what they tell you since 100 years. After every socialist experiment that failed, even they admired Joseph Stalin in the 30s. And they admired, of course, Mao Zedong in China in the beginning. But after it failed, then they said every time, oh no, it wasn't real socialism. And I think this is crazy. Imagine a housewife who bakes a cake and the guests get sick, they have to vomit. Yes, she invites some guests and they have to vomit. And 1 week ago, she understood, okay, there was something wrong with the recipe. She makes some modifications and she bakes again a cake with the same recipe, but with some new ingredients, and guests again get sick and have to vomit. Then the third week, she invites guests again. And again, she makes some modification of the recipe, but it remains the same recipe, and the guests get sick again. They have to vomit. And then she does it 24 times. You will tell me this is a crazy example. There's no housewife in the world who is so crazy to do this. This is true, but this is exactly what socialists do. To do always the same thing, and they tried it in so many different ways.
Yeah.
They tried it in Cuba in another way than in Venezuela. They tried it in the Soviet Union in another way as in China. They tried it in Yugoslavia in another way than in Bulgaria.
It's still a shitty cake, no matter which way they bake it.
But wherever they did it, there's not a single example in history where socialism improved living conditions of people. Not a single.
But what about, and you're going to hear this all the time, but what about the Norwegian countries? What about Sweden and Finland and all of those countries, right? I mean, first, I would question the size, just the pure population. That's not a lot of people, right? I don't know the demographics.
Yes, this is true. In Sweden, you have only 10 million people. In the United States, 300.
Yeah, you have 10 million people within 100 miles of where I am right now, and it's a very hard. It's a much bigger population.
This is not the point. The point is, Sweden is not a socialist country. On the contrary, if you look at the index of economic freedom, Sweden is number 10 and United States number 25.
Yeah.
That means Sweden is much more capitalist today than the United States. By the way, I read the last book from Bernie Sanders. The title is...
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yes, the title is...
your brain didn't... Dr. Z, your brain didn't fall out, did it?
Huh?
Your brain didn't fall out, did it?
No.
After you read the book by Bernie Sanders, right? By the way, this is the book that made Bernie Sanders a capitalist and made him a millionaire, right? That's the book, right?
The title of the book, it's okay to be angry against capitalism. And in this book, he writes that one chapter is there should be 0 billionaires in the United States. But what does it mean? Let's come back to Sweden. Bernie Sanders told us about Sweden or Nordic countries as an example of his socialism. But the truth is that in Sweden, you have 60% more billionaires than in the United States. 60% more, of course, adjusted to population, right. Of course. Right. But so Sweden was a kind of socialist country in the 70s. They called it the democratic socialism, but it was a total disaster. And they understood it. I tell you a funny story that you can find in my book, The Power of Capitalism. There was this author of children's books, Astrid Lindgren. She was very famous with Pippi Langstrumpf and her fairy tales.
Oh, yes.
And she was more left-leaning, social democrat, but one day she realized how much taxes she had to pay. Imagine, can you guess how much taxes she had to pay?
Well, and this is back to your other American hero of Ronald Reagan. It's probably, 90% at that point. I don't know. I'm just putting it out there. What was it?
It was 102%.
102%.
102%.
That makes so much sense. That's the state for you, right?
She wrote an article in one of the leading Swedish newspapers. She called it a tax fairy tale. And then the Minister of Finance said, no, you are wrong. You calculate wrong. But later they had to admit she was right. And even the Prime Minister of Sweden had to apologize and to admit that she was right. Wow. And a lot of entrepreneurs left the country. For example, maybe you know this producer of furniture, IKEA. I think you have it in the United States. And he was the richest man in Sweden at this time. His name is Kamprad. And then he left Sweden. He went to Denmark, but it wasn't better in Denmark. And for the rest of his life, he lived as one of the richest men of Europe in Switzerland. So, but people in Sweden are smart. They understood that it was a crazy idea with the socialism. And then they started in the 90s with free market reforms. They have still high income taxes today, but this is what you have also in New York City, for example. In New York, I think if you add all the the federal and state taxes, we have also something like 50%.
Yes, sir. 50 to 60%. Yep.
Yes. So, but in Sweden, what a lot of people don't know, they abolished the wealth tax. There's no wealth tax. They abolished inheritance tax. They abolished the gift tax. So if Bernie Sanders tells us about Sweden as a role model, my answer is, first, make clear that you abolish the wealth tax, inheritance tax, and gift tax in the United States. And you should know that what I said before, that there are 60% more billionaires in Sweden. So Sweden is not a socialist country today. This is what people think, that who know nothing about economic history. They live 50 years in the past.
Well, I love that you're bringing it to light and sending it out there. So let me recap for listeners. I think you said it so eloquently and so with such beautiful, simplistic elegance. And that is, capitalism is basically this: more market, less state. Everybody say it with me 3 times. More market, less state. More market, less state. More market, less state. Anything else you want to add? Other definitions. If you look at Hayek, I love Hayek's definition of capitalism. He says it this way. I'm going to kind of paraphrase him, but he says it's about strangers cooperating with other strangers in mutual benefit. I love that definition.
Yes,
What's your take?
I make one suggestion in my book, In Defense of Capitalism. I have one chapter that is not written by me, but by a friend of mine. This friend of mine, his name is Wang Chang. He's an economist at Beijing University. And the funny thing is that an economist on Beijing University explained what capitalism means much better than everyone else. This was the reason why I added this chapter to my book, because I said no one else could explain it in such an easy way as he did. So you should read my book. Let me add something about the book. I had a lot of interviews in the last month, like I think 50 interviews in the United States with radio stations, TV stations sometimes. And one journalist asked me, do you think you can convince people with this book? And you can convince anti-capitalists? And my answer was, no, I don't believe so. And he asked me, but why do you write a book if you don't believe that you can convince anti-capitalists? And I told him the reason is they will not read the book. They will not buy the book. I know it. Sometimes I post it, for example, on Twitter, on social media and the internet about my book, and then I get this comments from left-wingers, from anti-capitalists. This is all crazy. This is all shit. This is all wrong. And then I answer only with one question: did you read the book? No, I would never read a book like that. Right. That's their answer. So right. No, I wrote the book for people like you, and I hope a lot in our audience who are pro-free market, to give them all the facts and all the arguments to defend capitalism. Because this is not easy. For this book, I used 360 scientific books and scientific papers about a lot of different topics. And not everyone has the time or want to read something like 360 books.
Well, and you summarized it so well in the charts and graphs that you provide. And those are such powerful data points for readers and viewers and listeners. So be certain to check out the book. So the power of capitalism, right?
There are 700 footnotes in the book, so everything is with evidence and proof. But don't be afraid; it's easy to understand. Everyone who can understand, for example, Wall Street Journal or newspaper like this can understand, of course, my book. And there are a lot of topics. For example, we spoke about poverty, but there's another important topic today, and I have one chapter about it in my book. Anti-capitalists, they say capitalism can lead to monopolies like Google or Amazon or Facebook. They call it monopolies. And of course, capitalism can lead to monopolies sometimes. But what's more important, capitalism destroys monopolies time and again. And I have a lot of examples that the power of monopolies is overestimated time and again. There was a headline, for example, I have a quote in my book in 2007 in Guardian, what is one of the leading newspapers in the UK. And the headline was, "Will MySpace ever lose its monopoly?" Today, if I have this picture on my lectures, and young people, they don't even know
who you're talking about, right?
And at the same year, there was the front cover of Forbes magazine. It was Forbes 1 billion customers who can ever Nokia 1 billion customers who can ever kill the cell phone king or catch the cell phone king. Of course, today, if I ask people who use a Nokia phone, so there are only very few people. So or another example, I think in the United States, I'm not sure, even today, if you want to make a photocopy, sometimes you use the word Xeroxing. It was because Xerox had in the 70s 95% market share. This was really monopoly. Today it's less than 2%. Or think about Kodak. They had 85% market share. So I have a lot of examples that, of course, capitalism can lead to monopolies, but much more important,
ultimately they break up the monopoly that was, and that's that creative destruction capability that, again, if you let the market, as you're sharing, and economic freedom be the driving forces, human beings always want to be free. And that's why capitalism, it is not the end all be all, but it is an absolute light on the path of human transformation to freedom. And I love it. I've got to bring it back because I know you've done all these books on economics and capitalism, but I want to bring it back to you, Dr. Z, and your story. You have another book out there. I have yet to read it, but it's The Art of a Successful Life. And I got to learn, when did you write that book and what's that about?
A few years ago, and this is a book I collected 250 quotes from more than 3,000 years, starting with philosophers from ancient times like Cicero to Goethe. And I end with people like Steve Jobs or Arnold Schwarzenegger. So a lot of different people you find a mixture. And I have not only the quotes, but comments. What does it mean for your life? And there's another book that will be published, I think, in 2 months. Maybe then we can have our next interview. I would love it. And I will tell you, because it's brand new. It's Unbreakable Spirit will be the title.
Is this your next book?
The next book, Unbreakable Spirit. It's about these successful disabled people. And why did I write the book? Because I hate this victim mentality that we have today. Everyone wants to be a victim. Everyone has excuses why he's not successful in life. I'm black, and because of slavery and suppression of black people, I could be successful, or I'm disabled, or I'm gay, maybe, or LGBTQ, whatever. Or
I have small biceps, Doc. I have small biceps.
Yes, I'm a victim of whatever, of capitalism or what. So I wrote this book about successful disabled people. I will give you one example. A great man, I spoke with him. His name is Eric Weinmeier. He's American, and he's blind, and he was the first blind man to climb the Mount Everest. And he did not climb only the Mount Everest, but he climbed the 7 summits, the 7 highest mountains on 7 continents, being blind. And if you know this story about these people, or another one, Nick Vujicic, he's born with no
he has just no arms. He's just
no legs.
Yeah.
And he's so successful. And he's one of the most successful motivational speakers in the world. And by the way, he has a pretty wife. He has 4 children. And if you read the stories of these people, and this is what I mean with capitalism, is more as an economic system. in a way, it's a philosophy. You believe not in the state, but in your own power.
Amen,
And
Doc.
this
Amen.
is what I saw.
Well, Doc, I could talk all day with you, and I'm going to be talking with you next to have you back. I know you've got another interview to roll to, probably another country to go to. But this has been fantastic. So listeners know how to follow you. What's the best way to do it? Of course, go to Amazon, get your books. The latest would absolutely, again, be The Power of Capitalism and In Defense of Capitalism, the latest book. Where else do you want people going to learn about you?
Yes, I only started now with Twitter X. It's called X today in English. I do a lot in German, but you can't read it. And I have not so much followers now, but I want to have more followers now. But the most important thing, read my books. If you don't like to order it on Amazon, you can get it also Barnes & Noble, for example, online, In Defense of Capitalism. And if you want to do me a favor, you and other people, if you read the book, write something on Amazon, what you like with the book or what you don't like on the book, whatever, because this helps to spread the message. Don't buy only one book, buy some of these books to give it to other people, not to the anti-capitalists. They will not read it. Give it to your friends who are pro-free market to support them, because I can guarantee one thing. If you read this book, you will win every single discussion about capitalism, whether it's about poverty, whether it's about inequality, whether it's about climate change or environmental destruction, whether it's about monopolies. And there are 10 topics, and I refute all these arguments from anti-capitalists.
No, that is fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Z, for being a guest on the Intellectual Capital Show. I know everybody's going to love this interview. So with that, I'm going to ask you to come back in the future for the next project, okay?
Thank you very much. I appreciate it very much and hope to speak with you again. And it's great to have people like you who do a lot of things to spread the message of capitalism. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
You got it. Thanks, Doc.
Thank you. Hey. Goodbye.